And oh, good. Yeah, we're on. Okay. Hey, everyone. Hi. Good. Terrific to see your faces, and hi to our congregation out there. You can probably hear me, but we have the camera trained on the visuals up above. But before we get into Poland, where I was able to spend, what a friend of mine, a colleague who was on the trip, Rabbi Menachem Kreditor, informed me we were on the ground in Poland for 44 hours, and that's it. Feels like a lifetime. Certainly made an impact for a lifetime, but not including flying time, which is about 9 hours, give or take, to Warsaw from JFK, 44 hours on the ground. I'll give you a sense of what the trip was like. Some of you may have heard me spur of the moment, stream of consciousness almost, sharing images and details from my head of the trip midway through the trip when I was in Warsaw in my hotel room. But I'll give you kind of more complete picture tonight. But before I do that, I want to share just a few thoughts about what I've been up to. I have been privileged to spend the winter of 2021 and the winter of 2022 on sabbatical. It's a time for deepening my learning and growing my leadership. And it has been truly amazing for me to have had these experiences. So just a little bit about how I spent my sabbatical. I feel like it's like one of those book reports you write in 4th grade, how I spent my summer vacation. So how I spent my sabbatical. Leadership and learning, both of which I, of course, do as part of my day-to-day at Westchester Reform Temple, but rarely take time out from the day-to-day to grow. And so I dedicated myself to several avenues of Jewish learning, as well as several new opportunities for leadership. I'll share 3 of each so you get a sense of how these 6 months were spent. Most of my time, you know, one can never plan for the world these days, and it would not have been my desire to plan for a sabbatical in the middle of a pandemic. So time that I had originally hoped might be spent traveling was in fact spent traveling no farther than my living room. But there's a lot you can do online now. And by this winter, I was able to travel not only to Poland, but I spent all of January doing leadership and learning from a beautiful Airbnb in Santa Monica, California. It was really a great time. In fact, had a really nice drink with your daughter, as I think you know. Just randomly ran into Larry and Celia's kid, Meredith, outside of my apartment in Santa Monica, and we ended up totally hitting it off, no surprise. Learning. So for me, the heart of being a rabbi is learning Torah and teaching Torah. In everything I do, I hope to share my joy in Torah. So I decided that there were a few areas where I wanted to grow in Torah, by which I mean Jewish wisdom, not just the 5 books of Moses. Hi, Rich. Hi, Diane. Nice to see you. Good to see you. So 3 highlights from my learning experiences during my sabbatical period. 1, I enrolled in the clergy leadership program of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. That's a mouthful. But if you just go to IJS, Institute for Jewish Spirituality, ijs.org, you can learn a lot more about this amazing organization. It's based in New York City, and much of the programming they do is not for rabbis. It's actually for members of the Jewish community. It's for anyone who wants to deepen one's experience of Judaism through study, through meditation, and through what we call embodied practice. Embodied practice means not just using your head or your feelings to approach your Judaism, but actually using your physical body, using yourself. So in the clergy leadership program of IJS, 40 rabbis and cantors from all across the US, Canada, and Israel come together for 4 week-long retreats. Most of the retreats are silent. Our cohort met for the first time in January of 2020. We begin our days with prayer. Obviously, that's not silent. With music, with Hebrew, with English, and with being together as a sacred community. We have breakfast together, but silently. The rest of the morning is spent in meditation and in yoga, embodied practice. We have an hour for lunch. You're encouraged to take a walk, to journal, to do some reflection, to look at your study materials. You're silent until about 3 in the afternoon, and then you have a 2.5-hour lecture and study session. And then you're allowed to speak with your colleagues. You study in pairs and small groups. You have dinner together. You're allowed to socialize. There's an evening program. By 9 o'clock, you're silent again until about 3 o'clock the next day. So I was able to do that, but since the first retreat was in January of 2020, and if you've been paying attention to the world since January of 2020, you probably can surmise that we were not able to gather in person ever since. I was supposed to have had 2 more retreats and 1 coming this summer. Please God, the summer retreat will take place. It's supposed to take place on a beautiful Jewish retreat center outside of Baltimore. That's my hope, that I'll be back in person with my colleagues. The rest of it has happened all on Zoom. In addition to the retreats, every week I meet with a rabbinic colleague. For much of the sabbatical, I was meeting with Rabbi Jenny Rosen, who's an incredible Reform rabbi based in Manhattan, who is leading an initiative in responding to the climate crisis called Dayenu, appropriate for Passover. It means, in this context, enough already. It's time to make change. She and I studied every week. Now I'm studying with Rabbi Michelle Perlman at Congregation Beth Chaim in Reading. We meet on Zoom every week. We study Jewish mystical and Hasidic text. We reflect together. We do some meditation together. I do meditation twice a day, every day, as well as yoga. It's become a part of my life and my own spiritual practice, and it has truly deepened and grounded what I hope to do as a spiritual leader. So that's 1. 2, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, and Renewal. So lots of different denominations, men and women of all different ages and stages of their rabbinate, and rabbis and cantors, really. And some of them whom you may know, Rabbi Ken Chasen, who was my predecessor here at WRT from 1998 to 2003 as the associate rabbi of WRT. He's in my cohort. It's really a very special experience. Number 2, in the learning department, I decided to go back to Hebrew school. After 22 years of being a congregational rabbi, almost, coming up this June, and not having been in an intensive Hebrew program since my first year of rabbinical school. I did 2 years of university Hebrew, and then my first year of rabbinical school, everybody's in Ulpan, which is intensive Hebrew learning, 5 days a week, half a day every day, only Hebrew, speaking, writing, conversing, and living in Israel. I decided it was time to go back to Hebrew school because I flex my Hebrew chops only in translating ancient texts in the day-to-day of my rabbinate. And every time I lead a trip to Israel, I'm really tongue-tied. And I decided it was time to improve my conversational Hebrew skills, so I enrolled in an Ulpan online, an intensive, immersive Hebrew program. It meets twice a week for 2 hours a time, plus probably 10 to 15 hours of homework a week. And I've now completed 2 semesters of what's called Citizen Cafe Tel Aviv. My Ulpan most recently was comprised of a teacher in Tel Aviv and 10 students in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Buenos Aires, New York, Seattle, Toronto, Amsterdam, and Brussels. And it was an outstanding group. So really, really, really have loved flexing my Hebrew muscles again. And actually, I've also committed to having weekly conversations with an Israeli friend, only in Hebrew, corresponding only in Hebrew with a few people. So that's been really wonderful for me. And I hope that it will be reflected in my teaching and learning with the congregation. And then finally, in the learning department, in addition to my IJS study and my Hebrew study, I've enrolled in the Rabbinic Yeshiva Intensive Talmud program at Hadar, which is a yeshiva, and it's really a New York City-based hub for advanced Jewish learning and spiritual development. So I've been blessed to be able every year to study Talmud, both online and in person this year. And it was in the middle of my study in Hadar that I got an email from the UJA Federation asking if I would join a delegation of 18 rabbis to go to Poland and visit the border of Ukraine. That was on March 8th. And they emailed me at about noon on Tuesday, so just like 5 weeks ago, and they said, trip leaves Saturday night, we come back Tuesday night, the night before Purim. We want an answer by 4 p.m. So I was, at the time, in a Talmud class, and we were studying commentaries on the book of Esther. Specifically, we were reading the book of Esther for Purim, chapter 4, verse 14. And I called Kelly and I said, I just got this amazing invitation, but I don't know what to do. I don't like to fly. That's part of my own stuff. I don't know if I want to go to Poland. I don't want to just be a tourist. I'm on sabbatical. I'm not sure if this is the right thing. And Kelly, in her inimitable Kelly way, lovingly said, well, I'm sure the universe will tell you what to do. Yeah, she doesn't need the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. She's got it. So I said, okay. So I go back to Talmud class, thinking about this opportunity, a little bit skittish about it, and I'm sitting looking at the text, Esther chapter 4, verse 14. And Mordecai says to Esther, you must not remain silent, for if you do, surely salvation will come to the Jewish people from some quarter, but who knows what will happen to you and your household? And perhaps, Mordecai says to Esther, it is for this very moment that you have arrived at a place of leadership. I said, thank you, universe. I said, okay, the answer's right there in front of me. I really have to go. When else am I going to be able to go to Poland and do this holy work and report back to my congregation and bear witness to the suffering of the Ukrainian people, but also bring them a message of hope and that there are millions of good people across the world who care about them and will care for them wherever they go, even though they have no idea what awaits, and we'll see some images that tell this story in a moment. But I knew that the book of Esther was speaking to me. I also said, when else will I have an opportunity not to have to worry about missing the Purim carnival or missing a bar mitzvah or having a wedding, which is the reason that a bunch of my colleagues couldn't go. Angela Buchdahl, who was, of course, one of the first asked, was not able to go on the trip because she had a wedding Saturday night. Well, I'm on sabbatical. I should go. So that's been my learning adventure. In terms of leadership, I'll just give you a few ways in which I've been developing my leadership outside of WRT during my sabbatical. I took on a leadership role within the Reform Rabbinate, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. I've never really done any volunteer work for my rabbinic association. This is really my professional association, my union, as it were. We are not unionized. This isn't Amazon in Staten Island. But I called up the leadership of the CCAR and said, I'd like to volunteer for the movement. I'm on sabbatical. What can you have me do? Within 2 weeks, they promoted me to be the co-chair of the annual development campaign. So, be careful what you wish for. So now I'm hitting up my rabbinic colleagues for money. And I'm actually finding it to be a really wonderful privilege to be able to approach my rabbinic friends and say, if you care about how your voice is amplified in the world, if you care about the fact that we shouldn't just go at this work alone, because being a rabbi can sometimes be a bit lonely, then support the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And lo and behold, if you just ask really nicely and you keep asking, people will eventually part with their hard-earned money to support something they care about. So I've been doing that, and it really has been outstanding. The second adventure in leadership that I've undertaken during my sabbatical was to organize a coalition of 10 rabbis from within District 16 in New York, which was recently redistricted. So this is the congressional district in which you are presently sitting and in which a number of you live. Anyone who lives in 10583 is in District 16. I live in White Plains. I live 1.5 miles from here, but my district is District 17. As of Election Day 2020, the representative from District 16 to the U.S. Congress is Representative Jamal Bowman. And he was inaugurated, like his first day on the job was January 6th. His second day on the job was January 6th. At the time, prior to his election, I had reached out to him saying, if you're going to be our new representative, and the polling was suggesting that at that point, I'd like to have a relationship with you. I'd like you to know about what's on the minds of the Jewish voters in your district, which includes Riverdale and much of southern central Westchester. It's been redistricted so that it actually goes all the way up and includes parts of like Putnam and Orange. It's a bizarre shaped district now. I invited 9 other rabbis to join me in this effort from Mamaroneck, Rye, New Rochelle, Riverdale, Scarsdale, Larchmont. We all have met with Congressman Bowman many times. I speak with his chief of staff and with the congressman regularly, and we have been instrumental in helping the congressman understand what's on the minds of his Jewish voters. I'm not going to get into all of the details around this. Some of you who've been following local politics might surmise it's been extremely complicated. I was hoping to be able to come to you tonight and say it was because of our efforts that Congressman Bowman signed on as an early co-sponsor of furthering the normalization of relations between Israel and various Gulf states and Arab states in the Middle East, including Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, known as the Abraham Accords. He did sign on for that. And then while I was on sabbatical, he retracted. What you should know as members of WRT and people who, at least if you don't reside in his district, you are now sitting in his district, is that disapproval was conveyed to the congressman on his about face on the Abraham Accords. We, however, were instrumental in getting him to go to Israel in the first place in November on a trip sponsored by J Street. They may not have been my very first choice for an organizational sponsor, but J Street, as a pro-Israel, pro-two-state solution organization, worked very hard to give the congressman and Congressman Mondaire Jones from my District 17 an authentically broad view of Israel-Palestine politics and the issues facing people who live in Israel and in the Palestinian territories. So what can I tell you? Politics is not an easy business, and it does not surprise me that the Jewish community is investing significant interest and energy in a primary challenger to Mr. Bowman, and I have a meeting with the challenger next week. So it has been meaningful for me, however, to realize that when you have the privilege of being the rabbi of the largest congregation in Westchester County and one of the largest congregations, Jewish congregations in the state of New York outside of the city, it really is meaningful and important for me to be able to sit with our local representatives in Washington and talk to them about what we perceive to be the matters of concern for the Jewish voters in the district. And you have my pledge that I'll continue to do that, whoever is sitting in Washington, whether that person is friendly to those interests or contrary to those interests. And then finally, I joined the board of the UJA Federation of New York in 2021. I was invited to be a rabbinic representative on the board of our big umbrella philanthropy, the largest local federation in the United States and therefore in the Jewish world. And I have been for many years a supporter of UJA, but only through the last 2 years and especially the last 2 months have I come to understand the incredible work that UJA does. To date, UJA Federation has released the better part of $15 million just in its relief campaign for Ukraine. And so when they asked me to join a number of wonderful colleagues, some of whom I know, like we've been friends for years, and some of whom I met for the first time at JFK, not only because of the Book of Esther, but also because I care so much about UJA Federation. I care so much about what's happening in Ukraine. I believe that our Jewish conscience, our Jewish history, our Jewish values, our Jewish text calls us to respond. So it wasn't hard to get to yes. And so now I'll just kind of transition into the trip. So it was a month ago today that we left Saturday night. We went to JFK, and I'll say a word about what that looked like, but I've just decided to put a few framing thoughts on the screen. The first is a quote that I actually have in poster size on the wall of my office. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, when? And I realized that this statement, one of the Jewish tradition's probably, greatest hits, speaks to me of the responsibility we have not only to advocate for ourselves when we are in need, and we as a Jewish people, as we will read in the Pesach Haggadah just 2 nights from now, have time and again endured as history's victims. We have had to be for ourselves, and yet because of that, we must have developed an empathy whenever God's children are suffering. If we are not for ourselves, who will be for us? But if we are for ourselves alone, what are we? Our Judaism, in my view, is hollow if we do not internalize the lessons of the Pesach, our liberation festival, and say, the work of liberation in God's world is not done. And so another phrase from Pesach. You'll be reading these words as part of your Passover ritual this weekend. Arami Oved Avi. My father, my ancestor, was a fugitive Aramean. It's very interesting that when we tell the Pesach story, the Magid section of the Haggadah, the word Haggadah actually coming from the Hebrew verbs, here is my modern Hebrew, lihagid, which means to tell a story. Haggadah being the story, the noun form. We start the story not with the book of Exodus. You would think, where's the story in the Jewish literature about the Exodus? There's a whole book of the Bible named for it. And that is not what the Haggadah gives us as the starting point of the Jewish story. The Jewish story actually starts with a verse from the deep outfield of the Torah. Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah. And from within the last 8 chapters of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 26, verse 5, Arami Oved Avi. Who are we as a people? We begin with the declaration, and this is the thing you are supposed to say in front of the Kohen, the high priest, when you arrive in the Promised Land. Every year, you bring a basket of your best fruits and veggies, you present them to the Kohen, to the priest, and you begin a special declaration that starts like this. My father was a fugitive Aramean. We Jews do not start our story as we are the descendants of kings. We don't even start our story with we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. This is before all that. Our origin is that we came from a place before Canaan. We came from a place before we arrived in Eretz Yisrael as refugees. We were running. We were always refugees. And I think that it's powerful to locate, to center our identity as refugees right now with the backdrop of what's happening in Ukraine and the displacement of millions and millions of Ukrainians, a population of about 45 million people, now more than 10 million internally displaced, and probably 5 or 6 or 7 million already having left the country. And every day the numbers are updated. At the time that we were in Poland, I believe that the number was 150 Ukrainians were coming into Poland every minute. So, Warsaw, at the time we were there, that's a month ago, had swelled by 15%. 300,000 Ukrainians had arrived in Warsaw. Hundreds of thousands, indeed millions more, have not even made it as far west as Warsaw. They remain in the border region. We'll get to that. And then one of my favorite lines from modern Jewish thought, this is from Mark Hetfield, who's the director of HIAS, and I'll say more about HIAS. We used to take refugees because they were Jewish. Right? I don't know about you, but my great-grandparents, all of them, on both sides of my family, both my father's side, which comes from Pinsk in what is today Belarus, and my mother's side, which come from Minsk, also in Belarus, they all came here seeking refuge from what was happening in that part of the world at that time. possibly victims of pogroms or afraid that their village would be the next one attacked, with the sponsorship or the looking the other way of the Tsar's henchmen, possible conscription into the Tsar's army, where Jews were notoriously placed on the front lines in the most perilous conditions, subject to any manner of peril and death. They all came over to the US between 1904 and 1910. All of my ancestors, I'm a third-generation American. The fourth generation back all came here within the span of 6 years. Whether or not they thought of themselves as refugees, that's what they were. Fugitives from a place that had become untenable for them in which to live. We used to take refugees because they were Jewish. HIAS began in the 1880s as an organization specifically designed by Jews who were already living in the United States of America to help those coming over from Eastern Europe. We know that waves of immigration began in the 1870s, 1880s. Most of the people in this room probably trace their American story to that immigration phase between the 1880s and the 1920s. Some before, some after, but that was the large cluster of them. Now, however, HIAS's mission is to accept refugees from wherever they come. And we don't do it because they're Jewish, we do it because we're Jewish. Now, I will say in Ukraine, before the crisis, nobody is sure of the numbers, but somewhere between 200 and 400,000 people who identify as Jewish were living. Obviously, that number is greatly diminished. So a goodly number of Ukrainians are Jewish, and anyone who's been paying attention in the Jewish world knows that the president of Ukraine, that Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish. He's not particularly proud or open about it, by the way, but he has decided that it's a good talking point if he wants to raise tzedakah for his cause right now. All of a sudden, Zelensky is a little bit more proud of being a Jew because he's realized that there's a strategic advantage to it. But here in the United States, here at Westchester Reform Temple, we abide by this axiom. We used to take refugees because they were Jewish. Nowadays, we will take in refugees from wherever they come, whatever faith or non-faith they do or do not subscribe to. We take them because we're Jewish, and that's what Jewish people do, because Arami Oved Avi, because my father was a fugitive Aramean. Or because, as the Torah says 36 times, you know what it is to be a stranger, having been strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay. So there we are. You can pick me out. I'm in the blue puffer coat on the far right in the back. That's only some of the luggage we brought with us. The orange bags were packed by volunteers working with AFIA Foundation, an outstanding. You can go to afyafoundation.org for a continually updated list of humanitarian supplies that you can collect and donate. I learned a lot about how supplies are collected, donated, sorted, and eventually delivered to the victims, the people in need. So we all brought humanitarian supplies. Every single one of us also brought additional luggage filled with supplies just for Ukrainian refugees. Those bags were all in Ukraine. They're mostly medical equipment. Those bags were all in Ukraine by the day we left, by Tuesday. So we arrived Saturday night, we saw them over the border, and we received reports that they had been successfully received by our aid representatives on the other side of the Ukrainian border. We got on LOT, which is the national Polish airline. Pretty good. Nice, it was very nice. It was like a big wide-body Boeing 789 direct flight from JFK to Warsaw. And we immediately got on the bus. We didn't go to the hotel, we didn't shower, we didn't shave, we didn't sleep. I didn't sleep on the plane. We landed at around 1 p.m. We immediately went to the JCC of Warsaw. And the gentleman on the left, I'm sorry, he's backlit, is Rabbi Michael Shudrick, who's a really interesting fellow. He is the chief rabbi of Poland, and he's a New Yorker by birth. Grew up in New York, was ordained at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement's training ground for their rabbis and cantors, up in Morningside Heights near Columbia. And the woman on the right panel is Agata Rakowski, or Rakiowski, who I'm not very good at pronouncing Polish. I did my best to learn a few guidelines. And Agata was with us for the rest of the trip. She is the director of the Jewish Community Center of Warsaw. Here's the story from the JCC, which is true of every organization we visited. And the common thread among the organizations and the personnel we visited is that these are all grantees of the relief monies collected by UJA Federation of New York. So when UJA says we've dispersed $13 million or what have you for the Ukraine crisis relief, the JCC of Warsaw is receiving some of that money. You can go on the UJA website and see how they've divvied up the allocations in a very neat, easy, digestible graphical format. So as a grantee organization, you can see I'm eating lunch. This is the first food on land we had seen in quite some time. We met with them, and we were able to hear how just 2 weeks before the war broke out in the last week of February, Rabbi Shudrik and Agata decided that, looking as if things were going to be bad, they would convert all of their logistical operations into refugee relief. And so now every day around the clock, the JCC of Warsaw is collecting supplies, sorting them. They have a crew of volunteers, some of them you can see by the window there, that are tasked with sorting supplies, bringing the supplies to the Ukrainian border, and helping refugees, providing bus transit from the border to other parts of Poland so that the refugees can figure out their next steps. And even providing shelter, though it's not a very big facility. And I want to say that this is true of countless organizations, both Jewish and non-Jewish, throughout Poland. They've all gone all in on refugee assistance. And this is a country that in 6 weeks' time has now absorbed more than 4 million refugees. So when you hear President Biden, and he should be lauded for this, promising that the US is going to take in 100,000 refugees, that's, by the way, a 1-year cap. That is 10 times the amount that was promised under the Trump administration. Under Trump, it dropped from about 40,000 a year to 10,000 a year. Poland has now warmly received 4 million. Just a little food for thought. We went immediately from the JCC to the Novotel. That's a hotel. It's a nice hotel in downtown Warsaw. And part of the lobby floor has effectively been converted into a diplomatic territory of the State of Israel, run by the Jewish Agency for Israel, or JAFI. The Jewish Agency is the Israeli national organization that, among other things, provides transit and all of the mechanisms for making aliyah. If you want to make aliyah, if you want to immigrate to Israel, you go through the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency also sponsors emissaries, or shlichim, a shaliach, here locally throughout communities all across the world, including in Westchester County. I met with our community shalicha, Shachar Liran Hanan, just last week. She's great. So we met with refugees. We had to go through Israeli-style security. Like, you ever been on a flight to Israel, you know what they do, you know, on El Al. We had to go through that level of security to get into this part of the hotel. And we met with the refugees pictured in the lower left-hand panel, and we heard their stories through a translator. I'm going to share one story in a moment. Then, on the last day of our trip, I'm going out of chronology here just so you see it, these are the same people in that room boarding a bus for the airport to go to Israel. So this was part of the first wave of Ukrainian Jews who have been successfully processed for Aliyah. About 2,000 Jews have thus far, up until today, made Aliyah to Israel after having fled Ukraine. Again, the vast majority of Ukrainians, Jewish and non, remain in the border countries, chiefly Poland. Most of them don't want to leave the immediate vicinity because they hope, maybe I would say hope against hope, that they will soon be reunited with their husbands and fathers who are fighting the war. Conscription is in effect for all males ages 18 to 60 in Ukraine, and people who dodge the draft, you may have seen there was an article on this in the Times a few days ago, are looked upon with extreme disdain. Some of them fear violence against them if it is revealed that they are escaping the draft. Men who have special medical conditions, special family conditions, or 4 or more children may be exempt from the draft, but the vast majority of the males remain behind, and the vast majority of the refugees are women and children. Within 100 miles of the Polish border with Ukraine, there is not a bed to be found, not in a hotel, Airbnb, private residence, or community institution or facility. Every single inch of real estate is being used by the Polish people to house and help refugees. So these are some of the refugees we met through Jaffe, through the Jewish Agency for Israel, who are making Aliyah. You can't see it so well, but the one on the lower right is waving an Israeli flag. And this 95-year-old survivor of the Shoah is the one whose story I will tell. I don't know if you can see very well how sad he looks, but I think he's exhausted. So he's a 95-year-old gentleman who was living by himself in an apartment in Kyiv. His son had made Aliyah to Israel 2 months ago. His son, I think, was very smart and had some foresight. When he heard about the Russian buildup on the border with Ukraine, he said, "Now's the time to leave. We're leaving Ukraine. We're going to Israel." But his father, not unreasonably, said, "Boychik, I'm 95 years old. What do I have to live for in Israel? I don't know anyone. This is my neighborhood. This is where I was born. It's where I was raised. It's where I raised my family. It's where I'm going to die." Then war broke out, and his son came back to Ukraine to rescue his father. He made a very dangerous clandestine track in the middle of the night. He came through Turkey, which is one of the very few countries that is allowing entrance and egress from Russia, into Ukraine, extracted his father, waited 3 days online in sub-freezing temperatures to get him on a train to Ukraine. They watched several people die of hypothermia and other medical frailties, but they made it to Poland, they made it to Warsaw, and he was among that group that left for Israel on the last day of our trip. This is our band of rabbis. Many of you know Rabbi Jonathan Morgenstern. He's the rabbi of Young Israel of Scarsdale. If you ever participate in our community Tashlich, our Rosh Hashanah ceremony, where we come together as a Reform and Orthodox community down by Carpenter Pond behind Young Israel of Scarsdale off of Weaver Street, Rabbi Morgenstern is a very spirited young fellow. He and I call ourselves the Rabbi's Jonathan, and he decided, we had just heard these stories, and obviously these refugees are exhausted. They haven't slept. They don't know which end is up. They know they're moving to Israel. And Rabbi Morgenstern decided to lead us in singing. That's his son clapping. That's Morgenstern. They don't know any Hebrew. Most of them didn't know this song. And this is one of the things about Jewish identity throughout the former Soviet Union. You know, the Soviet state suppressed how do I do this here? There we go. The Soviet state suppressed open expression of Judaism. Many of us know that, so much so that for generations, Judaism was basically systematically erased by the Soviet regime. And this is true for most of the Jews in the Soviet Union, including Zelensky. Obviously, he knows he's Jewish. He knows that his family includes members who were murdered in the Shoah, but he doesn't have a religious understanding of Judaism. He's not in any way observant, and that is true of the vast majority of Ukrainian Jews and Jews from throughout the Soviet Union. When we did a temple trip to Berlin in May of 2019, we met a great number of young Jewish people who come from the former Soviet Union, and they were basically building Jewish life out of the whole cloth of a newly constituted Jewish identity for the community in Berlin, having no real memory, no real traditions, no real Seder memories, no flavors, no Hebrew, no songs, no rituals, no holidays, because it was erased by the state. So, yes, of course, the Nazis are often looked to as the kind of worst actors against the Jewish people in all of Jewish history. But let's give a second place to the Soviet Union, which not only purged Jews from the ranks of the Bolsheviks, multiple times Stalin executed purges largely against Jewish people, sent countless numbers of Jews to the gulags, but also engaged in state-sponsored erasure of Jewish identity for generations. So as a result, you have Jews who know they're Jews, but who have never been able to express what that means. And yet, the state of Israel takes them. And there's a lot to be said about the state of Israel. I'll have a couple more images. This fellow is Leszek Piłsudski, and we're now 20 minutes outside of Warsaw. So after we left the Novotel, it was starting to get dark. And we went about 20 minutes outside of Warsaw to the suburb town of Śródborów, which is, you know, it's sort of like as far as Scarsdale is from New York City, about 20 miles or so. And we were at a summer camp/retreat facility run by The Joint. The Joint, or the JDC, is the Joint Distribution Committee. They are the chief Jewish social service agency throughout Europe. The Joint really does a lot of incredible work helping rebuild and support Jewish life throughout all of Western Europe, through all of democratic Europe. And this guy is the president of the entire Jewish community of Poland, which is fewer than 10,000 people, by the way. But if you look him up on Wikipedia, by the way, he has a whole Wikipedia page. He's a longstanding Polish labor activist who has done his work primarily to support the rebirth of a Jewish community in Poland. Truly a heroic man. And he spoke to us about how this summer retreat and conference facility had now been turned into a refugee resettlement center. Every square inch, we didn't take a lot of pictures directly of refugees. We were not there to gawk, and we didn't do a lot of selfies, though I'll have a couple pictures that you'll see where you can see how we interacted with them. But he explained to us what this organization, another one of the UJA's grantees, is doing to support refugees. Everywhere we go, rooms are filled floor to ceiling with humanitarian supplies. By the way, if you're going to donate goods, please look at the website of AFIA to read what is most needed, and don't send bags that have everything all in one bag, right? If you pack a bag with clean underwear, bandages, and lollipops, you're causing volunteers to spend hours of their time sorting so that they put the lollipops in one room with the other candy, the medical supplies in another room, and the clothes in a third room. Right, so there's some things I never knew about just making humanitarian relief effective by making it efficient and categorized so that you are not taking volunteers' precious time doing what you could do, which is sort the stuff ahead of time and send it in homogeneous categories as opposed to all mixed up. The top picture, it's hard to see. Let's see if I have a, there we go. This one here, that's Rabbi Morgenstern. And Rabbi Morgenstern is an amazing guy. He's the guy who thinks to sing Am Yisrael Chai with a bunch of refugees bound for Israel. And he's the guy who remembered that it was one day before Purim, and he brought bags and bags and bags of Hershey's. And you have to imagine these kids, right, who have endured the trauma of leaving home. The saddest story, we met one boy, about 15 years old. This is the second time he has been forced to leave his home as a refugee. He lived in Ukraine for the last 8 years, but he comes from Syria. So he's a Syrian boy who was uprooted in 2015 from the Syrian refugee crisis, from his home near Damascus, moved with his family to Ukraine, which took him in as a refugee, and now for the second time in his life, he's leaving home to go somewhere he doesn't know. And by the way, both are connected by Russian aggression. That's a larger geopolitical story, but we know that the Russians were principal actors in the war in Syria and actually turned the tide against the rebels to basically reestablish the dictatorship of the Assad family. So there's Morgenstern smiling with some kids because he's the only one who thought to bring them candy. We left Śródborów. We drove another couple of hours and we arrived in Lublin, which is kind of in the far northeast portion of Poland. I said at the time it was as close as I've ever been to my ancestral land, to Belarus. But Lublin is interesting because it's also a city of significant Jewish history and culture. And we stayed for an hour or so and had dinner at this beautiful hotel called the Hotel Ilan. Ilan is a Hebrew word. It means an oak tree. So the Hotel Ilan used to be Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, literally the yeshiva of the wise sages of the city of Lublin, the principal yeshiva center for higher Jewish learning in all of Poland. And that's an immaculately preserved sanctuary that is just a museum. But of course, for the first time in years, having a group of 18 rabbis come to this hotel, formerly yeshiva, it was used as a synagogue that night. And this is Shaul Robinson of Lincoln Square Synagogue, and he led us in evening prayers. So it was really fun being with Orthodox rabbis who daven 3 times a day. They have a kosher restaurant on the ground floor. It was the only space in the whole hotel that is either not a hotel room being occupied by refugees or a storage room filled with supplies. So you get it. These are every institution in Eastern Poland is dedicated to the refugee effort right now. It was pretty meaningful to daven. We still haven't slept, by the way. It's now about 20 hours or so since we took off. It's getting close to 10 at night in Lublin, and then we finally, after davening, checked into our hotels. I got to sleep at around midnight that night, and we were on the bus at 6 the next morning. I probably slept for about 4.5 hours. Yeah, Alan. Still Torahs in the Ark, everything immaculately preserved. It's an unbelievable Orthodox-style Beit Knesset. The 2 or 3 goals, and the email came from Eric Goldstein, who's the CEO of UJA Federation of New York. He said, a number of you have asked us if there would be a humanitarian mission of rabbis to UJA. So it's clear that some of my colleagues had actually approached UJA, knowing that this is the one organization that is positioned to do this kind of work and to put together a trip like this on very short notice. So I thank the UJA for being responsive, but some of my colleagues whom I don't know must have asked the question. He said, we want to go to deliver humanitarian relief, to bear witness to the suffering of the Ukrainian people, and to come back to our communities with a deep awareness of how we can be involved in remediating their challenges. And also to teach our community more about how UJA does its work. And I have to say, you know, there's an old saying that says, you can't be an expert in snow until you've lived through an avalanche. And I feel that maxim came to me as I was on this trip. There are things that you just don't know until you actually see them close up. So it's 9 a.m. the next morning. It's Monday. we left JFK midnight Saturday. So this is taken about Monday at about 8:30 or 9 a.m. On the left, the mayor of Chisinau and a volunteer dressed in fatigues who's helping with the humanitarian efforts, accepting one of the bags from our delegation, and actually we then took it back and schlepped it 20 feet over to the hotel where it was deposited, and then the next morning it arrived in Ukraine by way of train. And this fellow is really amazing. His name is Mike Atkinson, and he is a philanthropist and a board member of Natan, who also is a trained EMT, emergency medical technician. And the first thing he tells our group, he says, oh, by the way, I'm Rick Jacobs' second cousin. So, and I said, well, what's the relationship through? And he said, well, I'm not really sure. It's actually on this side. I'm like, no, I know all of his family. He says, okay, you caught me. He said, but he claims to be Rick Jacobs' second cousin. He's an American who made Aliyah to Israel over 20 years ago. And he was in Poland for a month coordinating the relief efforts of this medical relief organization called Natan in constant communication with the Polish Red Cross. These Jewish organizations have come in and been accepted into Poland with open arms, but all of them are working in tandem with other international and in-house Polish organizations on the relief effort. So he's explaining to us what they do, and then we got to put on the orange vests. I think that mine on the back said psychological assistance, which I thought was kind of funny. But they all designated us as relief workers so that we could have access to the next point in our itinerary. So there's our group, there's one of our colleagues, and here we are having gotten off the bus in Przemysl. This word here, I love this, P-R-Z-E-M-Y-S-L, it's pronounced Przemysl. Many of you who've been watching the nightly news have seen images of a train station. That is the train station of Przemysl, and I'll show you a picture of it in the next frame. But we went about half a mile from where we convened and walked to this facility here, which is, for all intents and purposes, like the Cross County Mall. It's just an old shopping center. Well, what we think of as an old shopping center, like a 1980s shopping center, which in Ukraine is sort of like just a shopping center. And imagine if you were to go into the Cross County Mall, like the old building, the one with Home Goods, and there used to be a Circuit City on top and whatnot, and every storefront had been completely cleared out. Somebody had spray painted a different name. Over one, it says, charge your phones here. Another one, it says, medical relief. Another one says legal consultation. Another one says women's issues. Another one says trauma center. Every storefront in this mall was covered, every square inch of the floor, with cots. And on every cot was a refugee, often with children in her arms, or an aging babushka, an aging grandmother, every inch. Very well patrolled by Polish military and volunteer personnel from all across the world. Outside, well, this is inside. One of the stores had been converted into the Natan headquarters. So this is an Israeli doctor who's doing a 1-month shift, left her home in Beersheba to provide emergency medical services. She speaks a little bit of Russian. Anyone who speaks Russian, Ukrainian, or Polish has an advantage in signing up to provide relief work. She got the question. No. So she gave us a little bit of a talk on what they're seeing every day. This is the inside of the shopping center here. You can't really get a gist, but we weren't trying to take close-ups of the refugees. This is just the hallway. Every storefront is filled with refugees. And outside, this is one of the many kiosks operated by a wonderful charity called World Central Kitchen, where the only qualification is you know how to cook a meal or serve it. And people take 1 or 2 week shifts. They go to the border. Many of them drive 100 miles each way because, as I told you, there is no place to stay within 100 miles of the border. So you have to be willing to commute from a city like Lublin, drive 3 hours to the border every morning, come back every night, and do that for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and then come back to wherever you live. The UK, we met volunteers from Australia, we met volunteers from the United States, from Israel, and from all over Western Europe. This is the train station in Przemysl. Take a look now. Now that you notice this beautiful 19th century building, you'll recognize it when you see it on CNN. And this is what it looks like on the inside. It's all refugees. We went to the back platform and saw refugees coming off the train. We learned afterward that some are actually taking the trains in the other direction. Some have no direction, don't want to leave the border, and want to go home. And they are choosing to face the peril of living in Lviv in western Ukraine because it's not Mariupol. They're not going back to Mariupol. Rather than stay in Poland where they don't know what their lives are going to look like. It's really part of the tragedy. We also learned that, for instance, the Netherlands was offering at any time, on a moment's notice, buses to be filled with refugees to take them to Holland. They couldn't fill a bus because so many of the refugees refused to leave. From there, we traveled to the next border point. This is also on the news all the time, the border crossing at Medjica, Poland. I just want to highlight a few things. There's like a whole camp set up, like a camp made of makeshift tents and kiosks and anything that a refugee could need in the immediate, they can take. Food, clothing, medical supplies, toiletries, a charging station for their phone so they can sit for an hour and get their phones charged up. They're very wired up, but you know, they're trying to FaceTime anyone they know and figure out, where the hell am I going now? Do you have a place you can take me in? Is there anywhere in all of Europe that I can go? And this is the very first tent that they see. You probably can't tell that that's the flag of Israel. The very first tent on this side of the Ukrainian border. So this is facing Ukraine. On the other side of the green fence is Ukraine. I'm standing 4 inches from that fence when I took that picture. But facing the other way, that's what you see. So that's like what was behind me in that picture, is a army green tent with the flag of the state of Israel that says Hatzalah on it, which means medical relief. And the very first thing a refugee can do upon crossing the border is have a medical exam and receive first aid at a tent entirely operated by Israelis. And the staff at that tent, the doctors and nurses who were there, and EMTs were thrilled to have a group of rabbis they could speak Hebrew with. And then my conversational Hebrew really came into to use. That was really fun. There we are posing in front of that tent. That's our group. And then this is the opposite view. This is a woman who literally we watched her cross on foot into the border with her toddler who's being held by Polish military personnel right here. This gentleman is a volunteer who works for the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, the Jewish Disaster Relief and Community Support Organization that operates throughout Europe. And I wanted to take a picture of him, but you can tell that what I really wanted to do is show you this family back here. That's a family of about 4, a mother, a grandmother, and 2 children walking on foot with less luggage than I carried for a 44-hour trip. I already showed you the picture. I didn't take too many pictures at that point because I was just exhausted. We got on the bus. I schluffed a little bit on the bus. We went back to Warsaw. We arrived at the hotel, and we immediately had dinner with another federation group of Jewish Federations of North America, JFNA. They had about 40 delegates from all across the country, not rabbis, lay delegates, but also a few rabbis. We met with the chief rabbi of Moscow, an amazing person, amazing man, and he basically said, well, here's my problem. My community of Jews living in Moscow hates Putin and wants to leave but can't. So wrap your head around that maybe Ukrainians aren't the only victims of this conflict. There are millions of Russians who are also victims of this conflict, and somebody with torn loyalties like a Jew in Moscow is especially a victim of this conflict as well. The only way that they, like he, the chief rabbi of Moscow, who's also the chair of the Joint Rabbis of Europe, so a really impressive figure, the only way he and they can get into Western Europe is through Turkey, Kazakhstan, or I believe Uzbekistan. There's no passage through the ordinary, you can't go through Belarus or Lithuania or any of that. It's not safe and it's not legal. And it is becoming harder by the day for Russians to leave. So in addition to what we're hearing a lot about, the propaganda and the brainwashing and the fact that Russians are being told, we're winning this war, this is denazification, including, which by the way, some Jewish people believe. They really believe that this is a war against the Nazis because that's what they're being fed every night on the news in Russia. In addition to that, you have a significant number of Jews who want to leave but who don't think they can. So we had this wonderful dinner together. We did kind of reflections and farewells. And then we got up early the next morning. Some of us left the hotel at 5 a.m. to see off those who were repatriating to or making Aliyah to Israel, to wish them well, to give them more Purim candy and an Am Yisrael Chai and an Israeli flag to take with them for the journey. And then we had a concluding breakfast with representatives of the Moishe House, which is an amazing place. There's Moishe House in America. It's basically for young Jews in their 20s, post-college, but pre-family life, where they don't join synagogues, so what is there for them in the organized Jewish community? Moishe House is like communal residential living for young Jews in their 20s, and Poland, Warsaw, has a Moishe House. So we met with Moishe House residents, young Jews, who had taken in Ukrainians, including Jewish Ukrainians, but not limited to Jewish Ukrainians, to live with them. Really amazing to see the way in which the Jewish community has pivoted. I left one organization off the list just because I didn't have a photo. We met another one. 6 weeks ago, this organization was providing Shoah-related travel for teenagers throughout Poland, right? You sign, it's kind of like March of the Living. You're 16, you're in high school, you have Pesach break. You would ordinarily, in any year other than 2022, you'd sign up for a trip, you'd go with a bunch of teens, you would tour Majdanek and Auschwitz, and you'd get a real education in the Shoah, and then you go back home inspired to, you know, be part of Jewish life. Well, you're not getting kids doing that right now. And so every tour bus is being used to convey refugees from the border region to safety. It's really just amazing to see how organizations and people have turned their lives around. This is our flight attendant. Just want to point out the Ukrainian colors of yellow and blue on his lapel. He's Polish, but everywhere we went, yellow and blue. And apparently that's true throughout Europe, by the way. I had coffee with a recent college graduate this morning who said she just got back from Portugal. And she was traveling there with some friends. Everybody's wearing Ukraine flags wherever you go. And then the last image I'll leave you with, and then I'll just open up for Q&A. So we get on our flight. We had, on the way back, it wasn't a direct flight. We were on Delta. And we flew, actually KLM, which is code share with Delta. And we got on the tarmac at around noon. We were supposed to depart at around 12:30, but we were about 40 minutes delayed in departure. And so some of you may have seen my social media post around this. I said, have you ever applauded your pilot for a delay? And in this case, we did. Now, I'm not sure you'll be able to hear what he says, so I will just say, because he's speaking in accented English and the audio in this room is not fantastic. It will be, by the way. Yesterday, I met with our cantors and with our new in-house tech director, Idan Waldman. Idan is now part of the staff at WRT, so we've hired an in-house technical director to help with all of our AD. Thank you, Idan. But we were all listening to a professional acoustical and electronics company come in and test drive some unbelievable audiovisual equipment. Like, I was blown away. The sound in here is going to be amazing. When do you think it's going to be done, by the way? We're hoping for the high holidays. It's going to be a game changer. You'll be able to understand what I say for the first time. And then you'll decide, why have I been sticking around? Okay, so the pilot is explaining, he said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry for the delay, but the reason is that we had a very significant amount of paperwork to process the dozens of refugees who are on board our flight today.
Matter. It's good to have all these Ukrainian refugees on board.
We have many refugees on board.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you and to everyone on board of this KLM flight and now to Amsterdam. First on board who have short onward connections in Amsterdam.
So he was just explaining that we have a number of refugees on board who are leaving Poland. They come from Ukraine, and they're going to be welcomed in Amsterdam and throughout the Netherlands. So it was really what an image what a parting image from this adventure. Here's what I'd like to do with our time. Oh, and I've been very good about time. My intention is that we will have a hard stop at 9. So thank you we've taken about 1 hour for me to share with you a lot about the privilege of having time to grow my leadership and my learning while on sabbatical. Obviously, this experience was the highlight of my sabbatical, and it just goes to show you that you should never overplan the big things in your life, because you never know. You know, the best vacation Kelly and I ever took was a week in Rome. We had been there on our honeymoon, and I wanted to go back, but with different rules in place. The rule was no churches, no museums, unless that is what we are moved to do in the moment. So we took, for the first time, and maybe the only time, we took a vacation with no itinerary. I highly recommend it sometime. Go where the universe tells you to go. Allow yourself to be awake to the possibilities that might present themselves only because you are there in that moment. That was certainly what permitted me to have this experience, and again, I'm immensely grateful. Since returning, we haven't been sleeping or sitting on our hands. I've had the privilege of joining members from our delegation at the Polish consulate in New York City and meeting the Consul General of the Republic of Poland to New York. A young fellow, actually, is all of 35 years old, incredibly dynamic, told us a lot more about the Polish government's response to the refugee crisis, gave us a lot more statistics to back up the magnitude of what they're confronting in that country. Poland, by far, is the leading country in terms of responding to the refugee, a significant, multiples of numbers of refugees have arrived in Poland relative to any other country in the area. And I joined a faith leaders vigil in White Plains to bring awareness to this issue. And then there's what we're going to be doing here in-house at WRT. If it had not been a school spring break week, I would have been standing here with Sharon Stiefel, who's the newest member of the full-time senior staff of Westchester Reform Temple. Sharon joined our congregation in the brand new role of Director of Social Impact and Community Engagement. It is her job to oversee our multitude of program and calendar offerings and to infuse them with Tikkun Olam, with one of the core values of our congregation, which is our investment and involvement in repairing the world. And she is very much excited about the work that we're going to be doing in the direction of refugee assistance. So what I'd like to do is take some questions just about the trip so far, and then I'd like to ask my friend and congregant Karen Siegel to join me up front and to say a few words about WRT's work in refugee assistance, which is not something new. It's actually something we've been doing for almost 6 years. Yeah.
So you've spoken about all these multitude of organizations and everywhere you go, there's just filled with beds. Is there some organization that oversees so everyone knows what to do?
No. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of coordination with the Polish government. Thanks, Idan. You can do that for those who need it. Yep, that's great. Perfect. So the question was, is there any kind of central controlling organization? No, though it seems that the Polish government has invested vast resources, its military, its bureaucratic operations seem to be directed in these efforts of refugee resettlement. Obviously, the big one is the Polish Red Cross, at least from the medical needs. So what I understand is that the Polish government is actually the coordinating agency for all of these works. You have to be approved by the Polish government to come into Poland. If you're like an Israeli disaster relief organization, you have to apply, you have to meet certain credentials, but beyond that, I have no idea. This is an area where I'm going to have to do a lot of learning still. I mean, we saw one small slice of the response to the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of our time. Unfortunately, 6 years ago, I could have told you that was the refugee crisis in Syria, which, by the way, is ongoing. Or even as of this fall, the outpouring of people fleeing Afghanistan. The need, there has never been more mass migration of humanity than there is right now, at least not since World War II. And even then, the fact that we have refugee crises on multiple fronts in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, which I don't consider part of the Middle East, and in Eastern Europe, it's mind-boggling how many people have been displaced from their homes. And this could well be a harbinger of what we will see with increasing frequency and severity over the coming decades of climate-related upheaval. So I don't think this is a flash in the pan kind of event, or for us at least, certainly not for those of us who have many, many more years in front of us than behind us. Please God. I think that I am going to see a lot more of this unfold over the coming decades of my life.
Is he going to be doing anything as far as bringing people over here?
Is WRT going to be doing anything as far as bringing people over here? Yeah, the answer is yes. So that's actually, let me tee up Karen. Come join me. Starting in 2016, WRT officially announced its intentions to, here's a mic for you. Oh, can we get this one flying? Good. Hi, Karen.
Hi.
So starting in 2016, WRT, in response to the unfolding Syrian refugee crisis, joined forces with other local organizations and announced that we would become a refugee resettlement congregation. Of the 9 organizations that are authorized by the US State Department to do the work of actually resettling refugees in the United States of America, we decided to partner with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, whose byword I shared with you at the beginning of my talk. We used to take refugees because they were Jewish. Now we take them because we are Jewish. That felt very consonant with our values. I also thought it would be an easier sell to our congregation than working with Catholic Charities. Though Catholic Charities, as one of those 9 resettlement organizations, does outstanding holy work, then I'd be honored to partner with them. But knowing that some members of our congregation actually had loved ones who were resettled by HIAS, for me felt like a pretty easy pitch. Say, we're going to work with HIAS to settle refugees. By the way, they may be from Syria. I'm not going to give you all the history. I'm just going to ask you to time travel in your mind to what happened between August of 2016 and January of 2017. There was an election, things happened, refugees suddenly found themselves a point of political controversy in American life. A lot of stuff affected our ability to resettle refugees, but we actually welcomed a refugee family, 2 sisters from the Central African Republic, in April and May of 2019. It took us 2.5 years from the inception of our intention to do this work and the actual arrival. Karen has served as one of the core leaders of our steering committee for this effort, and I was so happy that she actually emailed me yesterday, and she said, so I think it's time for our efforts, which by the way have never been dormant. My wife Kelly is also one of the co-chairs. I can tell you, not a week has gone by without some direct interaction on refugee resettlement and working with our refugee family. They live 5 minutes from here in White Plains. We speak to them all the time, but they're not on public display because they're not a mitzvah project for Westchester Reform Temple. They are human beings trying to make a life in a very different country than the Central African Republic where they grew up, or Chad where they had lived in a refugee encampment for 5 years before being accepted as refugees. And then it took them, I believe, the better part of 2 years before they came here. So
Took a long time.
it took a really long time.
They
So
were
here,
part
speak into the mic.
Sure, they were actually part of a family, I think, of 6, and they were all hoping to come over, but it was just these 2 sisters who have been able to come over. I mean, I would just say I was, part of a large group of congregants, and I see some people here who were part of it also, to help someone who's a refugee leave a war-torn country and move here and become your neighbor is really a wonderful experience. And, the work feels important, and you are helping people. And so I would say that the focus of our group then was really just to settle a family, and that is what we focused on. We didn't do advocacy. We really didn't do other things, and it feels like now is the time for WRT to explore other ways of helping refugees, because it doesn't feel like a family from Ukraine is really going to come over anytime soon.
If it happens,
Right.
it will require many steps that will take a lot of our patience to see them unfold. The State Department first has to approve Westchester County for a stipulated number of refugees who will be approved to resettle in our area. And that's just the kind of last step. The refugees themselves have to be approved by the UN High Commission for Refugees and 4 executive branch departments, or 3 before you get to the State Department.
So it could take a while, really, before we could resettle
It could take
family.
years.
could take years. So in the meantime, I really think there are ways to explore, how congregants could play a role in helping refugees. And really just off the top of my head is advocacy. Because a lot of the Afghan refugees who are here and also the ones from Ukraine who will come really aren't here as refugees. They're just here as really for a year. And there's no guarantee that they can stay. So that's an area people could help. The organization that you were talking about with the medical supplies, maybe there are ways people can help. So I guess I would say to people, in our temple, that if there are these opportunities, and if we can find them, and if we, sort of put them out there and you hear about them, it's a great thing to be involved in.
We're going to host a communal gathering, like a round table, for anyone who wants to be involved in our refugee resettlement work. The incredibly hardworking steering committee is ready to pass the baton. So we're looking for not just volunteer leaders, but also people who can help to chair this effort. Sharon Stiefel will be an invaluable addition. She's an incredible asset. She, again, is our Director of Social Impact and Community Engagement. So unfortunately, or fortunately, we're going to have a lot of lead time to do this work. This crisis will be felt in waves for months and years to come. And my prediction is that it will probably be the better part of 24 months before Ukrainian refugees begin to reside in Westchester County. That's the real timeline, and that's how restrictive the US is about welcoming refugees. So there's still the possibility, by the way, of Afghan refugees, or what are called SIVs. They hold special immigrant visas. These are the Afghans who were collaborative with US forces during the war over the last 20 years, and therefore have a target on their back thanks to the Taliban. Most of them have already left, of course, but in terms of their eventual place of residence, it is possible that in the coming months, sooner than 2 years from now, we might see Afghani families arriving in the US and in our neighborhood. We don't know. We just don't know. But what we will do is we will go through the same process again. We will activate a core team. We will activate a support team of volunteers. We will go through the appropriate background checks and training process if we are, as a community, approved to resettle. So it's, like I said, it took 2.5 years last time from the time we said we want to settle refugees to the time they arrived. Now, again, there was some political baggage that provided obstacles, so that's why I'm saying I hope it's not 2.5 years. I hope it's more like 18 months to 24 months.
But I do think that there will be opportunities for congregants to get involved, to help refugees in other ways than just resettling the family.
Absolutely. I mean, there is education, there's coordination of humanitarian relief, there's the possibility that if the situation persists, but that we are welcomed there and are able to actually do hands-on work, that we could organize a temple delegation to Poland and the Ukrainian border. Again, not to be crisis tourists, but actually to provide volunteer efforts. Not a trip for the faint of heart, but something that I'm very interested in exploring with our partners at UJA. So,
And advocacy.
and advocacy here.
That's
right.
That's a real.
And especially with our government. Thank you, Karen. So if anyone, whoa, that's live. If anyone is interested in learning more about the efforts, you can speak to Karen. And also, I think you've circulated a sign-up sheet where our refugee task force can be in touch with you and tell you when the next meetings are at WRT. And like I said, I'll have Sharon Stiefel here to help with all of the tactical coordination. Other thoughts, questions, Frank?
Well, many years ago, I heard that the Ukrainians were bitterly anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, here's the answer. It's really complicated. Somebody who is better at math than I am can tell you what percentage, if 200,000 Ukrainians before the conflict were Jewish, and the total population of Ukraine is 44 million, what's the percentage? It's less than 0.5%? Yeah. Okay, that's not a lot. And so to have a Ukrainian president who is a Jew is an anomaly. And by the way, just fun factoid, in 2016, Ukraine also had a Jewish prime minister. Another Vladimir, by the way. I mean, Vladimir is John. So, not right now. It recently changed over. But for a time, they actually had a Jewish president and prime minister. This is wacky. The only country other than Israel where that has been the case in all of human history. It's just bizarre. Here's what I can tell. Excuse me. I don't know how Ukrainians feel about it, but I can tell you how we felt in this part of the world. It is very complicated being a Jew in Poland. It is very complicated being a Jew in Poland providing humanitarian relief to refugees, both Jewish and non-Jewish, 10 minutes from where millions of Jews were murdered in Majdanek, which is the case. It is a very complicated part of the world. Many of my colleagues, my Orthodox colleagues, did not have the good fortune to say of their families what I told you about mine, which is that mine got out between 1904 and 1910. I was with many colleagues, particularly my Orthodox colleagues, whose grandparents were murdered in Poland by the Nazis. It was also pointed out to me on the trip that the Ukrainian national anthem includes the following line: "We are the proud descendants of the Cossacks." So I don't know what it's like for a Jew to sing that line. It's probably a little like a Palestinian Arab living in Haifa being asked to sing Hatikva and say, here we are, the fulfilled hope of 2,000 years of Jewish longing. I imagine it is complicated. Or as we say in Hebrew, zemurkav, it's really complex. So, yeah, it is strange to perform acts of assistance in a part of the world and for people whose history is so tangled up in brutality exercised against Jewish people and Jewish communities. On the other hand, the other way of looking at it is that it was an incredible life lesson in the power of teshuva, of repentance, rehabilitation, and change at the soul level. You know, Poland is not known for being an immigration-friendly country. And to see the people of Poland open their hearts and their homes to refugees pouring in from Ukraine is inspiring. And that is, I mean, this is literally coming. There was one mayor of a Polish village very close to where we were on the border who who actually got voted into office as the mayor on a virulently anti-immigration and anti-refugee campaign when the refugees were Syrians. So it goes to show you, and I say this with some snark, it just goes to show you how different things are when the refugees are white women and children. I don't think that that's not part of the story. So, really complicated, though. I have to commend my Orthodox colleagues for whom even going to Poland was not a risk-free venture in terms of their PR with their congregants. Like when I said I'm going to Poland, the overwhelming response from WRT was, "We're proud of you, Rabbi. Go with our blessing." Overwhelmingly. I got not one piece of negative feedback about it. And by the way, from Democrats and Republicans, that's a difference too. Because in the last time I spoke about refugees, including from the Bima on Yom Kippur in 2016, when soon-to-be President Trump was still candidate Trump, and I challenged his view that what America needed most was more walls, I had people walk out. We had people leave the congregation over my public stance on refugees. Not many, thank God. My Orthodox colleagues, though, saying to a room full of Jews, I'm going to Poland, I had rabbis on this trip tell me that their congregants thought they were crazy. And in some way that their presence in Poland was a betrayal of their Jewish values. These are the people, after all, do we need to remind you, Rabbi, who murdered us and who tried to finish what the Nazis started after the camps were liberated. So, it's complicated. Other questions? Yeah.
People arrive at the border speaking Ukrainian or Russian, and there looks like 40 or 50 different organizations that are offering them help. But do they all speak those languages? Polish is not the same. And are there thousands of translators? That must be one of the biggest jobs.
There are thousands of translators. very high demand, and it depends on the kind of work you're doing. If you are doing work helping refugees figure out how to communicate with loved ones back home, or on the other side of the refugee camp, you can't see it, but about 500 yards behind us is a bus station. And the buses are running around the clock to take the refugees away from the border to somewhere a little bit more stable. Translators are all along there to help Ukrainians figure out what bus they're supposed to get on, because most Ukrainians don't speak Polish. Most do speak Russian, and I actually recruited a rabbi to the trip. I called UJA, and after I knew that I was accepted to the trip, I said, you've got to get my friend David Wilfond on this trip. David Wilfond is the new-ish, he started during COVID, rabbi of Temple Sha'arei Tefillah in Bedford. Rabbi David Greenberg is the rabbi emeritus there. So Gingy, we call him Gingy, which is Hebrew slang for redhead. Now you know why. Gingy, or my buddy David Wilfond, started as the rabbi there just this past summer. And I got him on the trip because he actually used to be a rabbi of a small congregation in Kyiv. And he speaks Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish. And he was an invaluable asset on the trip. He was the one person in our group who could go up to the refugees and say, tell me your name, tell your story, and then he would tell it back to us. So there's an extremely high demand. But if you have specialized skills in, for instance, medical services, then they'll take you no matter what. If you're a doctor who's willing to give of his or her time, go. Like if you have 2 weeks and you're a medical professional and you can go to the border, go to the border. But if you speak Ukrainian, Polish, or Russian, and you do anything like trauma counseling, go. Or if you know anyone who speaks these languages, there's a desperate need. There's a desperate need for more people who speak the language. And especially since Russia is not authorizing any of their people, obviously. Yeah, Frank. Minsk and Pinsk. Landsman. Right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, apparently Minsk is huge. Minsk is just this huge city that was full of Jews. You go to a place like Poland, by the way, and you realize there are 10,000 Jews or 9,000 Jews in the whole country, and it's really depressing. I mean, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture of what it's like being a Jew in this part of the world. They did an exceptional job of accomplishing their aims of ridding that part of the world of our people. Therefore, that was an added dimension to why I felt our presence was meaningful. Because we met with a ton of Poles, and when they asked us, why are you here, who are you, and we said, we're a group of rabbis, I have to tell, they were fascinated by our story, and they welcomed us very openly, everywhere we went. People we met in the McDonald's where we were using the bathrooms, we met one guy who was a volunteer at the border from Germany. He's a Seventh-day Adventist. We met another guy who's a Pentecostal minister. They were thrilled to see us there. So, Joni or Cynthia, was that a hand up? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I'll start with it's complicated. Okay, now that that's out of the way. Israel, many, including myself, would say, could be doing more for Ukraine. It's interesting, when it comes to refugees, Israel actually has a fairly complicated relationship. Let me go even one step back. When it comes to humanitarian relief, Israel tends to be a world leader. Right, you remember that awful collapse of the condo in Miami Beach this past summer? Israeli relief workers were among the very first to arrive. In the earthquake in Haiti, right. But when it comes to accepting refugees, Israel has a much different scenario. So Israel will send people abroad to do disaster relief. But when it comes to bringing people to Israel, it's a bit of a problem. The national charter of the State of Israel, and some would say the existential purpose of the State of Israel, is to provide refuge, and I'm using that word deliberately, for Jews. Israel is the national homeland of the Jewish people. And we could have a different conversation about, is that a form of chauvinism? Is that a kind of, yes and. Whenever Israel takes in people as refugees, it gives privilege to refugees who are Jewish. And on top of that, it does not, I'm just going to kind of name this, Israel does not want to take all refugees because of its issue with the Palestinians, who claim to be refugees, right? So if you're thinking from a strategic, high-level Israeli politician point of view, particularly on the right-wing side of Israeli politics, you're thinking to yourself, okay, our role as a state is to provide refuge for Jews. Now we've got a group of Palestinians who for at least 50 years have been geschrying to anyone who will listen that they are history's neglected refugees and that they should be granted a right of return, meaning they should be able to come back and reclaim homes and property in what is today the sovereign land of Israel. And therefore, when refugees come to Israel who are not Jewish, not so much Ukraine in recent memory, but places like Eritrea, which is another awful war-torn African country, or one that's more familiar to our story, non-Jews from Ethiopia or from Darfur. Israel is one of the more desirable places to go if you're fleeing from genocide in Darfur or war in Eritrea. But the problem is you arrive in Israel as a Darfuri or as an Eritrean, and you won't be recognized for refugee status, because what Israel's worried about is the Palestinians. If we say to an Eritrean, yes, you will be provided all of the protections and privileges that refugees in the state of Israel have, which, by the way, if you're Jewish, mean automatic citizenship, but we can't do that for you, because if we do that, then we're somehow signaling that the Palestinians who claim to be refugees are also eligible for citizenship in the state of Israel. And then on top of that, you have Russian oligarch money. Right? So there's this whole thing that I just gave you about refugees, which didn't even answer your question. But then you've got Israel's entanglements with Russia. And a lot of money for the Jewish state comes from the same people who are allied with Putin. And for Israel, additionally, a state that is being sponsored and propped up by Putin, namely Syria, is right on your border. And I wish I could just say that Syria is not a threat to Israel, but history teaches otherwise, right? So there are 19 other layers I'm not even factoring in. So yeah, it's complicated. And if one is to agitate for a more proactive stance or a more compassionate stance that Israel should do more for Ukraine, you got to start thinking like a right-wing Israeli politician, and at least to understand what's happening there. Rich. Also true. Really, really hard. The question is, a significant number of Israelis, 1.5 million, 2 million, are Russian. They tend to be very insular. They tend not to have melted in the melting pot of Israel. They tend to speak Russian. Very few of them actually speak Hebrew. They tend to kind of stick to themselves in enclaves. The answer is I don't know. But what I have heard from people who have Russian family in Israel is that it's a mixed bag, with some of them wanting to be apolitical, some of them strongly supporting the Ukrainian people, and some of them believing everything that state-sponsored media in Russia is telling them, because they're getting their news from their contacts back in Mother Russia, right? So what they're hearing, and particularly it skews generationally. So what I have heard, and this is all just anecdotal, is that the older folks, both in Russia and in Israel, are more likely to be swayed by the media that says this is denazification. And of course, if you're a Jew, that actually means something. Like, oh, of course I'm going to support denazification. Nazis bad, right? Well, not if it's a bald-faced lie. So that's what I hear. I hear that the community is not unified around this, but because they don't really talk to many people outside of their own, we have a few congregants who have Russian Jewish family in Israel, and they're the ones who are giving me this picture. I'm going to take one more question, and then I'm going to give you a concluding thought. Frank, please. I'm not. Okay. Hmm. Mm-hmm. See, these are things that would not fly in cinema today. Thank you, though. I'll put it on the watch list. Oh, all right. Okay, that's more my generation. Okay. Here's what I want to leave you with, my friends. First of all, gratitude. Gratitude not just for coming tonight, not just for what you've done to express support for and interest in this journey that I've taken, but also what you will continue to do to be part of our advocacy efforts, to get involved in this unfolding crisis. It is so important to me that this was not just something I did that I can now check off a list or put on a resume. It's really important to me that this work finds avenues for ongoing expression here at WRT. Institutionally, this is going to be part of what we will be doing. I don't have a strategy lined up yet, but I'd like you, our congregants, to help develop it with me over the coming weeks and months. Two, so that's homework one, and a word of gratitude. I also want to thank you for the support that you've expressed in giving your rabbi a sabbatical. I don't take it for granted. It was not something that was in my contract. It was something I asked the congregation for and was blessed to receive. And I want you to know how much it means to me, because although it was authorized by the board, it comes from you. And it signals that you have an investment in your rabbi deepening his learning, developing his leadership, and also not spending every week attending to the day-to-day business of WRT, which also means that you have cast a vote of confidence in the incredible clergy and professional staff of WRT besides me. And I know that there's some staff turnover happening at WRT. I promise you that for anyone who is sad to see not one but two rabbis leaving at the same time, you will find a sympathetic ally in me. And I also want you to know, for anyone who has questions or concerns about the incoming rabbis, you can put those to sleep. We have an amazing team of 2 new rabbis joining us. Everybody gets a freshman year. So please, I'm asking you and all of your friends that you're going to talk to about what's happening at WRT, please ask your friends to translate their concern into a desire to help our new rabbis become embraced and acclimated in the community. Somebody did that for me 19 years ago. We've done it every single time a new rabbi or cantor has joined our team. This congregation has been amazing about making them feel embraced and at home and helping them succeed. I've never seen before. Your job is to help them succeed at WRT. I know I can count on you. Finally, I'm giving you a lot of homework. This is your last piece of homework. Friday morning, you'll be receiving, tomorrow morning you're going to get the e-blast from WRT if you get the weekly email. I've included in it a prayer for your Passover Seder. I'm sending it as a separate standalone message on Friday morning. So just pay attention to the inbox. If for some reason by Friday afternoon you haven't received it, call the office, we'll send you a copy. I would love for you to read it at the Seder, but I care even more that even if you don't read this reading, do what Seders are supposed to do. Don't read a script out of a Haggadah. Have a conversation and find a way so that the people of Ukraine are not cast away from your Passover Seder. Bring them around the table. No, you can't physically bring Ukrainians to your Seder this year, but you can make sure that there are moments for conversation and education around what they are experiencing today, which is very much akin to what our people have experienced time and again in history, perhaps beginning with my father was a wandering Aramean, but certainly painfully expressed at the heart of the Passover ritual. We know what it is to flee a tyrant and to go to a place where we had no idea what life would have in store for us. Chag Sameach. Have a wonderful Chag. Thanks.